world today is changing fast. Yet some things prevail stronger than change. Wisdom prevails. Wisdom guides. It leads the way and shows what's right. Blessed by the wisdom of the ancient philosopher Chanakya, a strategist with a keen eye for defense. The Indian Army and Clause is back with its second edition of the Chanakya Defense Dialogue 2024. The inaugural 2023 edition united top minds from across the world, shedding light on AI, big data and beyond. We set the tone for India's defense leadership with Atmanirbharta as the mantra. In the journey of nation building, we see a common dream where growth is fueled through comprehensive security. A secure nation, a secure region, a secure world where peace reigns. The biggest defense leaders, strategists and think tanks assemble to strike a balance. Partnerships to technical know-how. Security, ecology, culture and more. Together, we strive to put India on the road to fulfilling its dreams of Viksit Bharat. The time has come for India to take its seat as the Vishwa Bandhu and give the world a safer, secure and stable identity. Chanakya Defense Dialogue 2024. Drivers in nation building. Fueling growth through comprehensive security.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're actually about to get started with the program. And let me also bring to your attention that our next topic is about sustainability. And we all know that the term sustainability, it's no more a buzzword. It in fact is an imperative. By now, we have also established that we might have a plan B, but we will not have a planet B. Session chair, we have with us none other than Dr. Tara KARTHA, Director of Research and Academics. In fact, she's also someone who's focusing on neighborhood and great power politics, and she's also served at the National Security Council Secretariat in the Government of India with a focus on Afghanistan, Pakistan and terrorism in the neighborhood. May I on the stage, we have with us Miss Elizabeth THREKELD, the Senior Fellow and Director of the South Asia Program at the Stimson Center College. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, leads the Habitats Trust, comes with over 20 years of experience in ecosystem and species conservation. May I please invite Mr. RUSHIKESH CHAVAN, founder of the Habitats Trust. Our final speaker for the session, ladies and gentlemen, we have the august presence of Lieutenant General Syed Atta HASNAIN, PVSM, UYSM, AVSM, SM, VSM and BAR, former General Officer Commanding 15 Corps, Srinagar and Military Secretary.
Sir, the question is how climate affects us, and in this session what we're going to do is we are going to look at the armed forces and defense. I mean, in terms of how do we balance our climate security with the needs of the defense forces? Because that's a lot, and that's a very, very serious issue which is coming up. I think some speakers ahead had said, you know, they referenced it. But my problem is that this is the crisis of the century. And I don't think there's enough realization of that we are going to have to deal with this one way or the other. And governments everywhere, I think, are slow to react. But right now, what we've got with us, we've got a bunch of experts who've been doing precisely that. They've been looking at climate. We've got Elizabeth, who's looking at climate and security. We've got RUSHIKESH CHAVAN from the Habitats Trust. I hope those things were put up, who's even worked with Navy and the whales. And who would think of that, right? Where is the connection, the Navy and the whales? He's even done that. He's worked with the ITBP, he's worked with the Coast Guard. So there's a bunch of things here which I didn't even know this kind of work exists. So that's terrific. We're so happy to have you with us. And of course, we've got General HASNAIN, who really, really doesn't need an introduction. He's on TV all the time. And second, of course, is the fact that he is the go-to person on disaster management. He's the person who knows this stuff. Now, when we come to the armed forces and security, I just learned from a member of the audience that the Navy is already looking at climate change, rising, sea levels in terms of how it builds its installations. So the Navy is always ahead of the game. In the US, I think there is a whole paper on this. There's a huge, the way in terms of climate-informed thinking. That's quite big. In how it's not just how you build your installations, it is also how do you get the local population to give you support on that. Because finally, when you have a disaster, it's not just your base, it's the whole area, right? And you need the support of those people around you. You need to make sure their development takes place and not just that we have this base and we're good. That's not how it works. So that's one aspect which I hope Elizabeth will touch on. And then there's the huge issue of biodiversity, which I think the French Navy, the French Armed Forces, by the way, they also have a paper on how do you deal with emerging climate crisis and how can the armed forces not just help, but frame policy. So I think that's where perhaps the Indian Armed Forces can take a leaf out of that in terms of how do we go ahead. Because there was this paper I read which said that last year, I think out of nearly 3/4 of the year, every single day you had a climate crisis in India. Every single day. That is scary, right? It's not something you can just brush off. And if you look at the map where these crises are taking place, it's all on the border, right? So you're going to have to deal with it whether you like it or not. Uttarakhand, in terms of, Himachal Pradesh, in the coastal areas, this is where the maximum events are taking place. Much of it also, by the way, in Punjab. So if this is you of course had that which General HASNAIN knows, the Sikkim tragedy, where 23 soldiers lost their lives in the glacial lake outflow. That was and these, from what the data that we see from very reliable sources, is that the GLOF issue is only going to get worse. Your heat, forget way back in the north. Let's face it, in Delhi we had the most severe heat that we could think of. How do soldiers, say, in the desert, how do they manage with this kind of heat? So those are the questions we'd like to look at. And I would request my speakers, actually, if you all could, in the end of your presentations, give us some, 1 or 2 points on how do we go forward. What is it that you found that when I was doing X project, this was what was the most useful? And number 2, this is what could be the most useful going forward, especially when you deal with governments. Governments are pretty much the same all over. They're all very difficult to handle. But how the community, the government, and especially I think in India, the state governments, which have their own problems. It's not that they don't work, it's that they have a different set of issues to go with. So at the end of your presentations, if we could have those points, that would be really great. So I'll give each of you all 10 minutes, and then we'll go, and I'm hoping to get an audience make this as interactive as possible, so that questions come in and we can take them on at any time you want. You can shout out to me. So Elizabeth, if you could go first.
Thank you so much, Dr. KARTHA, and a big thank you to the organizers at CLAWS. It is really a pleasure to be here with you all today. My name is Elizabeth THREKELD, and I am the director of the South Asia program at the Stinson Center. And we have traditionally focused on so-called traditional security issues, hard military, nuclear, conventional conflict. But over the last several years, it has just become inescapable that non-traditional security issues are just as more, if not more important, as we look at the security picture likely to evolve in the region over the course of the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. As Dr. KARTHA said, it's already happening. And I think my frustration in many of these conversations is that we haven't been able to wrap our mind around what that reality looks like and what that means for these more traditional conversations that we have about geostrategic competition and how we need to prepare for that. So hopefully we can do a little bit of fusion today. I think the other thing that I want to acknowledge here is I'm a researcher in Washington, D.C. There is a lot of expertise in this room on this panel, but also in the audience. I'm sure many of you all have seen the impacts of climate in ways big and small through your service. And so, as Dr. KARTHA mentioned, hopefully we can get a discussion going in terms of how that is shaping decisions, not just at the 50,000-foot planning level, but at the more immediate, close to ground tactical level. Because I think there's probably some bottom-up learning that should be happening there too. So what I'll do is go through 3 points or so. I will throw quite a bit of data at you, so apologies in advance for that, but trying to outline the scope of these issues. So the first thing that I'll cover is really looking at the scope of border infrastructure, and the northern border specifically. What has happened? What is on the ground so far, so we can get a sense of what we're looking at, the challenge that India does face in building out its infrastructure along the northern border. I will then cover the changing environment and the challenges that that brings to that infrastructure development, and bringing in the local communities as well, as Dr. KARTHA mentioned. And then lastly, I'll leave you with a few ideas of how best to balance and tackle those issues. And in all of this, I think the argument that I would like to suggest is that, yes, India is behind right now in terms of infrastructure building, that perhaps that actually could be seen as an opportunity to get this right, to think about the right kind of infrastructure that is going to be needed for the northern border as it will exist, and to be able to build some momentum behind that. So first, just a look at border infrastructure as it is now. We heard Dr. Sanyal in the previous panel talking about the reason why India has not traditionally built out its border infrastructure to the extent that China had. This idea that deterring aggression from the north through not building border infrastructure. That obviously is a thing of the past, and India is racing to catch up, but it is quite far behind. So just in terms of what exists on the China side of the northern border now, how this is developed historically. In 1959, there were 7,300 kilometers of roads in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. In 2022, there were 120,000 kilometers, a massive increase. As we all know, China has committed to build 624 new border settlements. And I think beyond just the villages themselves, it's the infrastructure that it takes to power them, to connect them. So that's a massive project. We've seen new rail links, right, linking Qinghai province to Lhasa. That is necessary for that, but also can facilitate the rapid movement of troops. And also a focus on last mile connectivity, including building out heavy lift capacity. So with the road, the rail, the energy, the infrastructure development that China has taken on, it also enjoys the advantage of terrain. So because, right, the Tibetan Plateau is a plateau, it is able to construct infrastructure for about 8 months of the year, versus India, which faces a more mountainous terrain in the southern Himalayas and gets at best kind of 4 to 5 months of the year. So there is a natural disadvantage there that India works against. Now, on the India side, racing to catch up. Obviously, we've seen the DSDBO road and the Atal tunnel, which were completed a few years back in Ladakh. And we are looking forward to the Shinkin-La Pass, a tunnel that would connect Ladakh and Himachal Pradesh. So that will provide useful connectivity. In the Tawang sector, the Sela Tunnel was just completed, providing year-round connectivity there. We've seen the Vibrant Villages program, of course, which over the next 10 years will see 2,963 villages supported, including through infrastructure, high-speed internet, energy infrastructure as well. There's been improved construction of a massive new hydropower plant in Arunachal Pradesh, and India is soon to complete the Udhampur-Srinagar-Baramulla rail length, which is very significant in Jammu and Kashmir. So that's kind of the state of play, where we are right now, the major projects on both sides. Where climate change comes into this is my second point. So how the changing climate and environment impacts this work. I'll lay out the 5 or 6 most significant climate-related issues facing the northern border, and then in the last section we'll put those together. So number one, as you might imagine, is global warming and how that specifically is going to impact India's northern border. So there have been studies done that shows by 2040 there will be substantial warming, particularly in Dimchuk and Himachal Pradesh, as well as Uttarakhand. There will still be warming, but a little bit less significant in the Depsang Plains. So basically the southern areas are going to warm more than the northern areas. And that, for military folks around the room, has implications, for example, in terms of frequency of patrols, areas that are able to be patrolled, the way that it might change how both sides use the territory that they are increasingly able to access. I think the other thing to think about is China right now enjoys an advantage in terms of cold weather gear and the infrastructure that's built up to facilitate its troops. So as the climate warms, perhaps that advantage becomes a little bit less significant, and India will be able to catch up to an extent if this is a slightly less extreme operating environment, though obviously with the altitude it's still going to be very challenging. With that warming, we look at permafrost. So obviously much of the higher level elevations and colder areas are currently permafrost, right? We don't see thawing of the soil. Research done at the Tibetan Plateau, so specifically this is the China side, by 2050, there are likely to be percentages on the order of 38 to 39% of the existing roads, rail, and power lines, and 21% of buildings will be threatened due to permafrost loss, the thawing essentially of the soil in those areas. That again is on the China side. We don't have, at least that I've been able to find, research on the India side, but you can imagine similar implications for India and also what that is going to mean for China. Rainfall, another thing to look at. So research done that the upper Ganga basin is likely to see many more extreme weather events and a potential increase in monsoon rains of between 4 and 25%, raising the risk of flooding and a lot of agricultural disruptions, difficulties that India's armed forces would need to navigate. We've already mentioned glacial lake outburst floods and the very unfortunate example from October 23 in the incident in Sikkim. India has 23 glacial lakes that are rated as critical, so they have been filled to the extent that they are at risk of an outburst flood. Of those 23, 17 are in Sikkim. And that, I think, is one of the most acute areas of risk that we can see. Looking back at that 2023 flood in Sikkim, it wasn't just the glacial lake outburst flood. It then led to the catastrophic loss of a dam, a hydroelectric dam, that had knock-on effects downstream as a result of that. What I won't cover in this section, but will allude to, hopefully we can get back to in the Q&A, landslides, earthquakes, villages sinking. These are all effects in part driven by human-led infrastructure buildup, but also are just a result of the very new mountain range that the Himalayas still are, so we should talk more about that. My last section here before I wrap up is just this question of what can be done to try to address this issue, to recognize the security interests of India, but also the ecological imperatives of managing climate change sustainably. So like I say, I think there is an opportunity here to do this right, to try to future-proof, to think long-term as best we can about the environment as it is likely to exist over the medium to long term. Human security has to be paramount in that, taking local communities into confidence about both the changing infrastructure but also the changing climate, and not just having that be a one-way conversation, actually sitting down, listening to them, because these are the folks who know the environment better than anybody else. They've seen the changes, they understand those dynamics. And it's not just the communities along the border, as we saw in the instance of Sikkim, for example. In those states further afield from the line of actual control and indeed farther down, there can be second-order impacts of climate change. And so this needs to be a broader educational campaign so people understand how the region is changing, what it might mean for them, but also what the Army and the government is doing to assist. With that, I think it's also important to acknowledge how diverse those communities along the line of actual control are. They have vastly different interests, and even just the topography itself is quite different. And so incorporating local priorities and also delivering services to them, right? We see this in the Vibrant Villages program, but upgrading the assets and the infrastructure that are available to them in order to continue building that trust. A big bucket that I would focus on, I would categorize as awareness and forecasting. So improving weather monitoring, installing new radar systems, looking at early warning capacities for things like glacial lake outburst flooding and other adverse events, so we can provide as much warning as possible to downstream communities. Leveraging satellite data as well, which is a novel space that there's a lot more that could be done in. With your point on state governments, there are a multitude of actors in this space, right? And that coordination is always a challenge. So sharing data and expertise across civ mill lines, federal to state governments, government to non-government organizations, really making sure that the institutional infrastructure, if you will, is in place to be able to accommodate that, particularly in a crisis scenario where things have to happen very quickly. I would also point to the idea of crowdsourcing impacts, reporting from on the ground, for example, landslides, which we haven't gotten into very much. These can be very small scale things that are cleaned up relatively quickly. But if there was a way of crowdsourcing reports of those minor landslides, there are actually advancements that are being made in predicting future risk of landslides that could be improved with citizen reporting of X, Y, and Z happened at this stretch of road. So something to look out there to engage the community. Lessons learned, hats off to NDMA. I have to say I read through the report after the Chamoli landslide, and there were a lot of very effective lessons there. And with that, I think the last couple of things I'll highlight, one is just green development, right? Sustainable materials, developing standards for construction of infrastructure along the border, and looking at ways that we can use light footprint to be able to get to the same effects that we need for security purposes. So this comes back to drones, to sensors. In some places, you're obviously going to need roads. We need roads to be able to move people. But I think it's also worth taking a look at alternatives. So things like ropeways, hop-on, hop-off airfields, tracked systems, like ski lifts that could be effective in some of these areas and less disruptive to local communities. And the last thing I will leave you with is the importance of cross-border data sharing. and cross-border engagement. So having talks with India and China, with India and Pakistan, to try to establish information from both sides about downstream and upstream effects of water levels. As China, for example, is building out a new major dam, India is going to have a lot of questions. And so being able to have those diplomatic contacts, even if it's challenging, I think is worth trying to do, because this is not just a domestic internal issue in India. Thanks.
Thanks very much. That was really, especially like the last few points you made. I think I don't think we have any choice but to share data, because it's not that you have a glacier and the other guy doesn't, right? So, Rushikesh, if you could go, maybe if you can limit yourself to 8 minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, like biodiversity, the population of the hall has also gone down, but I think this is a great opportunity for us. So thank you, Claus, thank you, Indian Army, for providing this opportunity. I think the bigger question is, what does biodiversity do with anything to do with security? And that is something that I think we try and address. We all talk about balance, and we try to maintain, equal amounts of development and taking care of nature. But that's really a 50-year-old concept. As the science has progressed, we've realized that it's extremely dynamic, and it's all about equilibrium. So it's like a food. You don't add salt as much as you add your rice or something else. And when the balance or the equilibrium kind of shifts, when something becomes higher, like the carbon dioxide or biodiversity loss, the stable state changes. Currently, the state that we are using, in the state that we are, the interglacial period, is great for life to survive as we know. But if it changes, it's not long before we become the dinosaurs of this planet. The planet will continue to be there. So this is typically what you talk about, what sustainable development is, again, and this is what we learn in schools. But really, this is also an old concept. And now what we've realized is that environment forms the larger thing, and it's more of a concentric circles. And thus, ecology and environment form the bedrock of economy and the society. So anything that happens to the environment or the natural world, it definitely affects the society and economy. And I think in the next few slides, that's what I'm going to touch on. So what's the correlation between security? There is enough and more studies globally published. I think every year there's a lot of publications. And there is a very strong correlation between environmental degradation and terrorism. Boko Haram is a classical case, where one paper said that environmental degradation pursues people to join extremism organization because there's just lack of resources. Both terrorism and climate change in the regions, you'll see a high overlap. And there are tons and tons of paper about this. So no longer environment or biodiversity has become a Sunday activity. I think it affects us every day in a way which bothers us. So coming to India, India has a rich history. And in fact, it has a rich legacy when it comes to biodiversity. The biodiversity of India was mapped by the armed forces. It started with Major General Thomas Hardwick in 1700, some 1778 if I'm not wrong. And many other defense personnel went out into the forests and the oceans and the rivers of India and started mapping our biodiversity. They started mapping the resources that we have. So there is Captain Skykes, there is Jordan, in fact one Indian called Colonel Jairam. They all started documenting the biodiversity of our country. And in fact, some of the butterflies, if you look at, they've been named as sergeants and colonels and the major, a butterfly is named like that. So there has been a legacy of documenting our rich biodiversity, but there's also been action taken. If you look at General Kumar Mangalam's work, and he established what is now called as the Territorial Army in 1960s, has done some great work. Masuri work has been very famous. At the same time, a lot of work that has happened. These TA battalions have won the Green Governance Awards from the hands of the Prime Minister of India. And the work continues, and I've had the fortune to work with practically most of the armed forces. And the work that they do is great. It's just that somehow it never gets the limelight it deserves. But I think the reason why I'm standing here is this one slide, that the Indian Defense Forces occupy some of the most critical areas for biodiversity and water security in our country. Be it Ladakh, be it Sikkim, be it Arunachal, or the deserts of Rajasthan. These are some of the most fragile ecosystems. And if we're looking at how glaciers have receded, or the bird that you see is a crane, a black-necked crane. Last few remaining population, less than 100 probably, left. No civilian has access to these areas. And all that the defense forces probably need to do is a marginally little more effort to just be cognizant of what's there. And just by your presence, you can protect a lot of things. You can ensure that the glaciers are there, the water systems are there, the biodiversity is there. Biodiversity and climate change are kind of together, and Dr. Tara was talking about what's the connection between whales and Navy. But whales, say a blue whale, for example, is 200 tons. And it is the reason why oceans can capture carbon. From the poop of the algae come up and they absorb carbon. When it dies, it sinks to the bottom and can feed millions of small microorganisms. They're great, but sonar pinging does affect them, does kill them. And US Navy, for example, has regulations on how do you regulate that without kind of harming the whales. How can you do your activities? I think the discussion is not how do you have development and environment at the same time. I think that's a passé. What is important is a regenerative process where, with given technology that we have today, if we can just add some bit of commitment to it, development and environment are actually, economy is, and ecology are sisters. Ecology is study of the home and economy is management of the home. They are the sister concerns. And if you can kind of look at it, we can definitely really contribute to the security of nation. Trying to stick to the timeline, so I'll just wrap it up quickly. But we have been working with defense forces. We've been working in Ladakh to look at some of the issues like dogs, the free-ranging dogs that are there. We're doing sterilization there. We have an MOU with the Navy where we are working on how do you look at whales, how do you ensure, in fact, Karwar Naval Base is the largest in Asia, and how do you, in Nicobar, you're coming up with another base. How do you kind of ensure that while you do the security of a country, how do you also secure the insides of the country? How do you secure the water? How do you secure our posterity? Of course, we work with Coast Guard and with turtles and ghost nets and things like that, but also with BRO, because infrastructure, border road infrastructure, when these roads that pass through some of the most critical areas, there are snow leopards, there are pikas, there are multiple other organisms that use that road and can get killed. And you have to make those roads. There's no two ways about it. But how can you mitigate your impact? And I think no one in this room or anywhere wants to have a negative impact of their actions. It's just that with a little bit of commitment and a science, we can have both economy and ecology because they are one and the same. Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, so I think that was brilliant in most, especially in terms of time. I really wish that we could have half an hour of you talking, because there's so much that you can teach us on this. And maybe at some other point, Claus can bring you in this subject particularly. Over to General HASNAIN.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Jai Hind to everyone. And thank you, Claus. Thank you, Indian Army, for having invited me for this wonderful seminar on a subject completely different, and on a theme which should be very alien to me. I know nothing about environment, I know nothing about ecology, but I know the effects of that. Because the effects of not following environmental practices, having a strong ecological footprint, is nothing but disaster. And that's my subject. That's my business today. Okay? Let me just say that the reason why you are here is primarily because of this. It's the lead component of the organizations that drive the nation in terms of this: ecology, environment, and disasters, which are all akin to war. Since you are all warriors, war fighters, you are the best people to handle it. Let me admit to you that my particular interest in the connection between comprehensive security and disasters really came into being last year, when I happened to visit the AG, General Viresh, in his abode in 33 Corps, and I was horrified to see what had happened in Sikkim on the 4th of October last year. Most people have forgotten it. The world forgot it simply because 3 days later, the 7th of October, the Hamas did an even bigger disaster by killing 1,200 people and taking away 250 hostages. And so the whole world's attention went to that. And no one bothered about what happened in Sikkim. But it drove us from the NDMA to go to General Viresh and ask him for his briefings. Oh my God, what outstanding briefings we got in 33 Corps. What outstanding briefings we got in Headquarter 27 Div. We were horrified to see what had happened. A glacial lake had burst out. It's just called a glacial lake outburst flood, GLOF, which had burst. Just one of the effects of that was that 3,000 tons of ammunition of the Indian Army had flown down the Teesta. 3,000 tons. That's 1,000 3-ton loads. No one knows this. Hardly anyone knows about it. So that got us thinking into that. My God, this is the kind of effect which can there on national security directly affect the capability of the Indian Army itself. The second connect in my mind I make between disasters and national security. These are 3 examples. Look at Somalia. What happened in Somalia? A drought. Thereafter, a famine. Happened in the early 70s, late or middle 70s. By 1993, you had the United Nations UNISOM, which was in Somalia. There was the beginning of piracy in the Red Sea. There was the beginning of terrorism, the Al-Shabaab, in all those areas of East Africa. All started from Somalia. Second example, go to Bangladesh. When we talk about migration into India, where does the route lie? It lies back in 1971, when almost 540,000 people died in that super cyclone, which actually accelerated the entire process of the formation of Bangladesh, the declaration of independence, if you go into the history of Bangladesh. And it led to huge migrations thereafter. The next time it happened in 1991, another super cyclone. 140,000 people died in that particular cyclone. And why go any way further? Come to Pakistan. In the year 2022, 2023, one of the biggest floods in the Indus River rendered 2.6 million people homeless. The World Bank and the IMF put together felt Pakistan would require $16 billion to resettle them. Pakistan has got $16 billion. It's going 24th time to the IMF for $3 billion. Where are they going to resettle 2.6 million people? Cast your minds back then. 3 million people came out of the Afghan crisis in 1981. The formation of the Taliban is linked to 1981. That is where the Saudi clergy came and converted everyone to radical Islam. This is the connection between disaster and security. That's what it's all about. And I'm so glad that the Indian Army today has now completely changed its colors on this whole issue, looking at comprehensive security in such a great way. And in that, introducing a subject such as this, which was alien to all of us many years ago. My compliments and congratulations to the Army Chief, to the hierarchy here, for having thought about it. That's very important. But to leave a thought in your mind, we are doing some good work between the NDMA and the armed forces of India, not the Indian Army alone, the armed forces of India, because we work with everyone. It started with, the whole hierarchy sitting here, started with the QMG, inviting us to his corps, 17 Corps, to do a program there. We did it with them. Outstanding feedback from there, how it was done. Thereafter, Central Command asking us to come to Lucknow and doing it with 4 states of Central India. And just recently, last month, we've done it with 6 states of Southern India with headquarters Dakshin Bharat area and headquarters Southern Command. And only yesterday, I've received a DO letter from 16 Corps to say, why don't you do it with us? Wonderful. I mean, this is what is making one happy. To see that the connect between disasters and national security is all there in the mind. And therefore, I should only leave a few thoughts with you on this, because I think the thinking is all correct already. If the armed forces, they must work to highlight their focus and concern on ecology, environment and disasters, 3 things you need to look at. One is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, 17 of them which have been outlined. Not much attention is usually paid in our academic circles in the armed forces to this. The second, the Sendai Framework. I wonder if how many people have even heard of the Sendai Framework. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Resilience, which is related to between 2015 to 2030. Last year we had a review of that. The surge towards 2030 has just begun. And the last is the Honorable Prime Minister's 10-point agenda for disaster risk reduction. This is what the Sustainable Development Goals are. Broadly, I'm not going to take too much time on it. The second bullet, the SDG agenda is based on the principle that no one can be left behind, that there are too many people in extreme and vulnerable situations of insecurity. And this kind of situation comes out of disasters. Of course, ecological and environmental impact, of course, that's a very important part of it. The third bullet, Sustainable Development Goals are a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the environment, reduce economic inequality, and ensure peace and justice for all. These are the goals, 17 goals, which you must try and Google, look at them. Cursorily, you don't have to go into very great detail. And you can see on the right side, environment is treated as a subset. Climate change, water ecosystems, land ecosystems. 3 things as a part of the SDGs. The effects of disasters, just look at it worldwide. 40 to 50,000 people averagely lose their lives. Last year, 86,473 people died. And disasters affected 93.1 million people. While you're reading this, let me tell you, COVID of 2020, how did it affect the Indian economy? And economy is a part of national security. Minus 24% in the first financial year. Minus 7.5% in the second year. We are fortunate as a nation, we came out of it and came to 6.5% thereafter. Not many nations have done it. 10% of agriculture GDP in low-income nations can be affected by this. And my second last, the Sendai Framework. The Sendai Framework is a guideline, primarily. Look at these 4 bullets that I've got for you. A guideline, essentially, to mitigate, reduce, enhance the capacity to be able to respond to disasters. That's what it's all about. It's a guideline, nothing else. It will show you how to go about going through the entire cycle of disasters. 4 things. understanding disaster risk, strengthening disaster risk governance, which means you need systems, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, which is what we are doing with the armed forces today, and enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response to build back better. That's the mantra now. You go have destruction, you don't just restore, you build back better. And the last one, the flagship point, the flagship slide of my presentation, the Prime Minister's 10-point agenda. If you just look at it, it covers everything comprehensively. Everything is covered comprehensively. I needn't go further on that. I'll leave you with our thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
So as always, General Hasnain makes us all think it's brilliant as always. Thank you so much. I hadn't frankly heard of the Centennial Report at all. So I'm not, however, a climate activist. So that's my excuse. But I was just thinking, in terms of just yesterday, there's this huge satellite picture I got of, stubble burning in Pakistan. Thousands and thousands and thousands of fires. Just across is ours. Few far less. But, this time the government is really trying to do something. They're dismissing people. They're suspending them. But surely this is something we need to discuss with our neighbor. You have no other choice. These guys are, all that is coming to Delhi. It's affecting us, our children. Number two is things like, say, Chinese illegal fishing, which is all over. There are hundreds. Look at the security issues involved. They trawl the seabed and they completely, which somebody here had said, talked about the coral reefs, everything is being wiped out because of these people. So if we were to talk even, I'm just thinking that with the Chinese troops being multiplied by God, I don't know how many hundreds on the border, the presence in those sensitive areas of human habitation, what is that effect going to be? So is it even possible for us to think, I'm asking you, General Hasnain.
I'll respond to that. Of course, this issue of stubble burning is just too political to comment upon.
Yeah. No,
right?
The Chinese aspect, that can you, if now that we've talked about, pulling back, can you shift to a kind of climate warrior basis? It's too much to ask as of now, but perhaps one could think of ways.
Of course, you see, this can easily be done through legislation, even, for example, right? But mostly in man-made disaster situations, there is always a give and take, a compromise issue. You don't do stubble burning, and you have a major problem of agriculture in Punjab, parts of Haryana, etc. You do it, you have a good food production, but you have an ecological disaster in Delhi and areas around it. How to come to a happy mix? That is where the political issue comes up. And that's where the compromise has to be sought by us. Of course, a lot is being looked at. We are looking at it from every angle. But I don't think we've got immediate answers available at the moment. But, of course, we'll just continue looking at it, I suppose.
Thank you. I'm going to, unless any of you want to make any specific points, just two minutes.
Yeah, on stubble burning, I think there was a point when we never had food. I hear my parents telling me that when they were young, there was no food to eat, and the food was imported, and that's when Green Revolution happened. So I think that was the need then, to grow the wheat and the rice that was grown the way it is. But today, agricultural science has gone far beyond, and the country's economic stability is also much better. I think we need to look at multi-pattern cropping. You need to look at climate-resilient cropping. And then there won't be a need to burn the stubble. How you fertilize your crops, how do you use pesticides in your crops, that will decide, and not trying to find a band-aid solution to...
You do have investment possibilities of investment in mechanical equipment, but that requires a huge amount of money. A call will have to be taken on that. Where does that money to come out from? How do you plan for that? That is the problem.
Just very briefly, I think actually climate issues can be a useful way of engaging, right? So imagine the possibility of creating a biodiversity preserve or identifying very sensitive areas like you were talking about that could be protected, and perhaps even having bilateral protections on both sides of a border. The other thing that I would point to, we mentioned sensors earlier, CHAVAN. It is a hugely sensitive, both ecologically and obviously political and for security reasons, space. And technology has advanced to the extent that we have such greater visibility than we used to. The manning of troops on that glacier has an enormous impact in terms of the environment, and so that could be a space just in a very limited area to consider ways that sensors could help to substitute over time for the deployments that are currently taking place.
I'll just open up to a couple of questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, Dr. KARTHA and the House. My compliments for an excellent presentations and to the knowledge. I wish to contribute by telling the House or highlighting a point how an awareness on green training is slowly and steadily catching up in the armed forces as regards the use of simulators. It all started in September 2021 when the government took out a policy on the framework of simulators in the armed forces, trying to usher in the use of simulators in place of using live ammunition. Those were baby steps in early days. The awareness to use simulators was rather lacking at that time, and were only about catching up. As the time has grown over the last 2.5 years, TERI, the Energy and the Resource Institute of India, has taken a huge move to partner with Army and the private industry to bring out as to how the use of simulators not only meet the training challenges, they are a great factor in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which cost thousands and thousands of crores of rupees. Just to bring an example, the study was presented on 5th June 2023 in India Habitat Center, and it brought out that a single round of INSA's rifle, fired or not fired, saves 0.280 grams of greenhouse gas emission. Now this looks insignificant, but multiply it by the thousands and millions and billions of rounds being fired, and not only small arms, artillery rounds, air defense rounds, armored rounds, and this awareness is now, the study is now being taken up by Niti Aayog as a one-day workshop on bringing sustainability initiatives in the armed forces, the green training initiatives in the armed forces, which not only restrict to the use of ammunition, it relates to the use of proper waste management, smart building, and so on and so forth. So this green revolution in the making is something which rhymes in consonance with what you gentlemen and lady have spoken, and I'm very happy to say that this awareness is catching up sooner than later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's an excellent point. I think there's someone here. Can someone get a mic here, please? Here.
Greetings, everyone. I am Wing Commander Taruna Yadav. So today we have spoken about climate change, extreme weather events like floods, droughts, landslides, avalanche, and we have seen how this climate change and extreme weather events is affecting the national security. Now we also know that climate change is not an isolated phenomena. It is inevitable because we cannot get the mindset of the entire country, the neighborhood, and the globe together at one function. So it is going to be inevitable. So my question now is it time for us to start investing more and doing more research on weather modification so that the weather becomes our ally instead of our adversity? And I would like to know if there is some work that is being done on it. And if not, then which organization should start working on it to make weather not as an adversity, but as an ally? Maybe it can become as a new strategic defense measure for us. Thank you.
There's a question here.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I am Colonel Sumit Uggal, Sir, my question is that around a decade back, say somewhere around 2009, 2010, there was a seminar on ozone depleting substances which was conducted by clause only. And subsequently, the action plan was formulated, and then headquarter technical group EME was made the nodal agency to look after and manage this thing. So what has been the progress by our organization, that is Army, on this aspect? How much we have been able to curb this emission of ozone depleting substances?
Yeah. For ozone depleting substances, the thing is, it's a great success story, actually. Ozone depletion was a huge problem 20 years back, but it was because of the chlorofluorocarbons that were there, especially in refrigeration. So the changes in technology, changes in replacement of gas has now actually, ozone hole is now closing, and to a point where we don't have to worry too much about the ozone layer anymore. So that's a success story, and hence we need not worry about it. I think the bigger challenges are climate change and biodiversity loss. So it's a success story. Your efforts 10 years back have actually yielded results.
Regarding your question on climate change, Madam Elizabeth, we will request you also to contribute to this particular aspect on artificial weather change, artificial climate change. I still remember about a couple of months ago getting a call from a very senior Army officer asking me to examine whether it was possible that the 33-core famous glacial lake outburst and the one before that in 2021 on the 7th of February, which happened in Chamoli, could these have been artificially generated weather events which led to cloudbursts, leading ultimately to a huge amount of rainfall on the glacial lakes, and the glacial lakes then bursting out? We went into the details of this. We examined it internationally. We spoke to a lot of agencies around the world. We could not really come to any conclusive evidence that this is available anywhere in the hands of our adversaries or anywhere else. But a lot of research on this is no doubt going on in the world. Artificial seeding, as you're aware. But those are very, very localized kind of things. They are not, it's not climate change in a nation the size of India, to change the southwest monsoon and at the moment the northeast monsoon which is coming in, to change the course of these monsoons completely. No one would first of all like to do it. It is too big a weather event, too big a climate event to try and interfere with. The moment you do it, there's no scientific data to tell us what the ultimate effect of that is going to be. You may interfere with one thing but create a calamity for yourself. We don't want to land up into desertification of India, right? So these are issues to be taken with a pinch of salt. But I know that a lot of research is going around internationally, and maybe, Madam, you could tell us about it.
I think that's a very good opening to focus on the importance of perceptions of climate change. So candidly, I don't know the latest and greatest on what is possible in terms of weather modification. I tend to agree with your assessment that these are bigger systems that we don't have a full understanding of. On actually the crop burning in the Pakistan side of Punjab, they are thinking about cloud seeding to try to deal with some of the pollution this time around. So there are localized conversations. But it's really interesting what you were mentioning, the NDMA questions that you'd gotten about whether this was potentially human-caused, and that's something that I have run across quite a bit as well, particularly with the Chamoli landslide. It seems like that was one of the disasters that there were a lot of questions about. And all of the evidence that I've reviewed similarly suggests that this truly was not a man-made event, but I think it opens the possibility of considering a potential other trigger for tension between, in this case, India and China, if we don't have clarity of information on what's happening. And particularly looking at the Great Bend Dam that China is considering building. This would be 3 times larger than the Three Gorges Dam, which is China's largest at the moment, and would immediately impact downstream river flows on the Brahmaputra. And with that, obviously, it's still in the construction process and thinking about, at this stage for India, what the implications are, having an understanding of how that could shape local crop patterns, water flows on the river, and getting to that data sharing stage so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where something happens and there are questions that are raised about whether this is actually more than meets the eye. There's an education component to that as well. But I think looking at potential crisis triggers in the future, that is high on my list of something that we should all be aware of.
Yeah, I think that's why I also mentioned this illegal fishing, because it's affecting Sri Lanka, it's affecting Pakistan, it's affecting us. And these Chinese trawlers who come in, they come in massive, huge numbers, and they're completely, so there are a lot of issues here which actually can be taken up should SAARC ever, meet up. This can actually be a basis for talking, and perhaps with China. There was a question here, and that's the last question. After that, we'll close.
Hi there. My name is Surinder Singh. I work as Sustainability Analyst, Independent. My question is to Ms. THREKELD, if I said it correctly. So NATO this year came up with the impact assessment of the climate change as well. I would request you if you could please share, or any of you could share some perspectives on what's the view from outside is where India is in terms of climate change readiness, and how or what would be the pain points or the hotspots where it will, let's say, affect negatively, to put it mildly. Thank you.
Thanks. I think what I can do if helpful, one of the things that Dr. KARTHA had asked me to do was to share a little bit about what's happening in the U.S. on these issues. And perhaps with that, I can then reflect on some areas for improvement or future work on the India side. So the U.S. Army has been at the forefront of pushing these conversations in the U.S., and actually since about 2007 or so, there have been very active plans in place across DoD, but specifically with the Army, it's the largest force, and they, back in 2022, released the Army Climate Strategy, which I would commend to all of you. It's a quick and easy read and speaks to the scale of the issue. The Army is a massive institution, has a lot of land, has a lot of people and personnel, and the way that the Army has taken on the climate problem, I think, could suggest ways that India's Army similarly could build using the scale that it has. So just a few very quick highlights. By 2035, there's going to be a microgrid on every installation, and by 2040, we're going to have enough renewable energy resources to self-sustain on those installations' critical operations. Zero net emissions for installations by 2045. 2050, zero net greenhouse gas emissions for Army procurements. On the training space, every 2 years, there's going to be a climate lessons learned study that's released starting this year, so be on the lookout for that. In 2028, all exercises and training will include climate in terms of impacts, but also things that would need to be potentially responded to down the road. There's going to be Climate 101 courses for installation planners and commanders at the garrison level. And on the vehicle front, right, because this is a massive force, we have a huge fleet just of vehicles. By 2035, they're all going to be hybrid and all electric by 2050. So even with those incremental moves, I think there are areas where India's Army could make very, smart goals, right, where they are time-bound, specific, and work towards those for future greening. And it's not just for the Army. We've seen over time in many other examples where the military really can lead the way on a lot of these technologies. And you have the scale, you have the scope, you have the expertise to be on the forefront of developing and putting into place new technologies that can then have uptake with the private sector too.
Thank you. I think we'll check out that report. With that, incidentally, I think the Indian Air Force has just given out a thing to the Uber. They're saying that we'll use Uber for our thing. So there we go. They're going ahead. So we're going to stop here. Thank you all very much for really, really fantastic discussions. Thank you to the audience.